Oh, and thank you for joining me. My name is Patrice Cannon, and I am a doctoral student at Liberty University. This presentation is titled Vicarious Trauma and Burnout in Educators. As professionals who work closely with children every day, especially those carrying significant trauma, educators find themselves absorbing the emotional weight of their students' experiences. And today we're going to explore how this exposure can affect teachers and what we can do about it. In this session, we're going to define vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and burnout, three conditions that affect educators exposed to trauma through their students. We'll explore how these conditions develop, how they manifest in teachers, and what research tells us about effective prevention and treatment strategies. We're going to look at how school systems can become part of the solution through trauma informed practices and policies. Educator trauma is not a localized issue, it's a global concern. According to the OECD, emotional exhaustion among teachers has reached crisis levels in several countries. Teachers are increasingly working with students impacted by violence, neglect, and poverty. Yet most have little to no training at all on how to handle the emotional repercussions of that exposure. So, what is vicarious trauma? It refers to the internal changes that occur when someone is repeatedly exposed to another person's traumatic experiences. Perlman and Sackveen explain that over time, this exposure can alter a professional's worldview, their sense of safety, and even their identity. For educators, this can mean feeling extremely overwhelmed, cynical, or emotionally detached from their work. Let's look at secondary traumatic stress. And it's defined by Figley, which involves developing trauma like symptoms simply from hearing or witnessing another person's trauma. Unlike vicarious trauma, which builds slowly, secondary traumatic stress can occur suddenly after a single incident. Teachers may experience sleep issues, intrusive thoughts, anxiety, after hearing a student disclose abuse or witnessing a crisis unfold even at school. Burnout is a response to long term workplace stress, especially in emotionally demanding environments. According to Maslow, Jackson, and Leader, burnout is marked by emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced sense of personal accomplishment. For educators, it's the feeling of giving everything and still believing that it's not enough. So there is a difference between vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, as well as burnout. And even though these things they look very similar, there is a difference. Um, it's important to differentiate these three terms. Burnout is caused by chronic stress and a symptom failure. Secondary traumatic stress is a trauma like reaction that occurs very quickly, often after very specific events. Vicarious trauma, on the other hand, it happens gradually and affects a person's inner beliefs and identity, according to Perlman and Figley. Understanding these distinctions, they can help us recognize the unique support each condition requires. So, educators as a high risk group. Teachers are especially vulnerable to trauma exposure due to the nature of their work. They are on the front line with our students. They engage with the students' pain on a daily basis, often without the training and the resources to process it. Um, Alisic found that teachers with personal trauma histories are at an even greater risk. So, if you have not dealt with your stuff before you go into the classroom, you are at an even greater risk for vicarious trauma. This emotional proximity makes education both deeply meaningful and deeply exhausting. Empathy is at the heart of good teaching. We all get into this profession because we want to make a change, but too much empathy without boundaries can lead to compassion fatigue. Figley notes that caregiving professionals often feel emotionally depleted when they take on the suffering of others without adequate recovery time. Teachers may feel morally responsible for fixing a student's life, even though that burden is far too heavy for one person to carry. And I chuckle because I've definitely been there as an educator. Let's look at Miss Johnson's story. And even though this is a composite case, I just wanted to kind of bring in a bit of reality and what this would look like. So let me introduce you to Miss Johnson, a fictional teacher whose story reflects the reality of very many teachers. She began her career full of compassion and passion and purpose, but years of working in a trauma heavy environment without support, it took its toll. She now finds herself exhausted, anxious, and disconnected. Ms. Johnson's experience is not unique. In fact, it represents the growing number of educators who suffer in silence every day. To understand how trauma affects teachers, we must first examine how trauma affects our students. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately 1 in 6 children in the US has experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. This includes abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, and even community violence. These early experiences can profoundly disrupt development and contribute to learning, behavioral, and emotional challenges in the classroom. Student trauma often reveals itself through behavior. Children whose who've experienced trauma may display aggression, defiance, or intense emotional outbursts. Others may withdraw, appear disengaged, or present symptoms of depression and anxiety. Without trauma informed training, educators may interpret these behaviors as willful disobedience rather than survival responses. So let's look at mechanisms of trauma that's absorbed by educators. Educators become secondary witnesses to trauma in a number of ways. They hear heartbreaking stories from students. They see physical or emotional signs of abuse. They are often the first reporters in the classroom. They often feel powerless to intervene. And over time, the cumulative emotional labor of carrying a student's pain becomes internalized, especially in the absence of support or supervision. Symptoms of vicarious trauma vary, but often include emotional numbness, intrusive thoughts, difficulty sleeping, and a heightened startled response. I used to say things like, it's just hard sometimes to cut my brain off, and that's why I wasn't sleeping. But working in high need areas for nearly 20 years, it is definitely a side effect of vicarious trauma. Teachers may begin to feel hopeless, cynical, or overly responsible for students' emotional well being. According to he emphasizes that these symptoms mirror those found in trauma survivors themselves, despite educators not experiencing the trauma firsthand. Burnout among educators has reached concerning levels. The National Education Association reported that 44% of teachers considered leaving the profession due to high stress. In trauma impacted schools, this rate is even higher. Emotional fatigue, unmet expectations, and a lack of institutional wellness support have made it very difficult for educators to sustain long term commitment, according to Herman. Certain educators are especially at risk, especially new teachers. They're still developing their classroom management and coping strategies, and they're highly susceptible. Susceptible, I'm sorry. Those with unresolved personal trauma may also experience emotional reactivation. And finally, educators in high poverty areas face a daily exposure to collective trauma, both the students and the community itself. Unfortunately, the culture of education often discourages vulnerability. Phrases like just push through it, be strong for the kids, everything we do is about the children. It reinforces emotional suppression. So, schools rarely offer dedicated time for reflection, peer processing, or even mental health. And the emotional neglect becomes normalized, yet it's incredibly harmful. Educators often enter the field with a strong sense of purpose, but when they are repeatedly exposed to trauma without seeing meaningful change, they may begin to question their impact. And this sense of ineffectiveness leads to identity erosion, where the teacher no longer recognizes or value their role. According to Hernandez, Gassi, and Engstrom, they describe this as a moral injury, which occurs when professionals feel complicit in a system that fails those that are trying to help. Many teachers suffer alone. There are few opportunities for structured emotional processing, and pervasive stigma exists around admitting emotional distress. As a result, educators internalize their pain, which compounds over time. According to according to Squires, he argues that systemic isolation contributes significantly to burnout and vicarious trauma in school settings. Teachers don't just educate, they intervene in crisis. They report abuse, respond to suicidal ideations, they manage classroom grief, they console students after violent incidents, and each event activates their stress response system. Over time, this constant activation leads to emotional exhaustion and physiological dysregulation, according to Jennings and Greenberg. Compassion fatigue, as defined by Figley, refers to the emotional depletion that arises from extended exposure to others' suffering. In education, it occurs when teachers continuously offer emotional support to trauma impacted students without time or resources to recover. The result is a decline in their ability to remain empathetically engaged. It's not about a lack of compassion, it's about running out of internal capacity to give. According to Laura Van Der Noot, she introduced the concept of trauma stewardship to describe a mindful and sustainable way of working with trauma. This approach emphasizes self reflection, balance, and awareness. Educators are encouraged to remain connected to their purpose while also paying close attention to the personal cost of their work. This model reminds us that caring deeply requires intention and discipline to avoid becoming consumed by others' pain. Dr. Stephen Porg's polyvagal theory, it explains how um, the nervous system responds to stress and trauma. And when educators are continually exposed to student trauma, their own nervous system can become dysregulated, causing fight, flight, or freeze responses. These physiological states impair emotional regulation, decision making, and connection, all of which are essential for effective teaching. Understanding this theory empowers educators to regulate their own stress responses in the moment. Attachment theory, originally developed by Bowlby, has significant implications in the classroom. Educators often serve as attachment figures for students, especially those with insecure or disrupted relationships at home. School definitely becomes a safe space for them. But this dynamic can trigger relational wounds in teachers themselves. And when educators are not supported, these deep connections can lead to re experiencing past trauma, reinforcing the need for reflective practice and, as well as boundaries. Moral injury refers to the emotional distress experienced when individuals are unable to act in accordance with their values due to systemic constraints. In schools, this might look like wanting to help a student in crisis, but you don't really have the time and you don't have the resources or the institutional backing in order to do so. And so over time, this leads to guilt, helplessness, and even disillusionment with the profession. Addressing the moral injury requires systemic, not just individual intervention. Mindfulness based stress reduction, which is developed by John Zen, is a research backed method of managing stress through present moment awareness. For educators, regular mindfulness practice can improve emotional regulation, reduce burnout, and increase job satisfaction. Studies also show that mindfulness supports better classroom climate and student outcomes. This strategy can be introduced through breathing exercises, meditation, and as well as reflective journaling. One of the most protective factors against vicarious trauma is connection. Peer support groups and reflective supervision often structured spaces for educators to process their experiences, reduce isolation, and build trust. According to Hayden, he found that teachers who participate in trauma informed reflection groups reported a decreased stress and increased resilience. These practices should be embedded in professional culture and not treated as an optional add on. Compassion resilience refers to the ability to sustain empathy over time without experiencing exhaustion. According to Weber, this involves self awareness, emotional boundaries, supportive leadership, and healthy team dynamics. For educators, it means being able to care deeply for students without being consumed by their suffering. It is not the absence of stress, but the capacity to recover and continue with purpose. Educators often neglect their own needs in service to others. A personal wellness plan help shift that narrative. And this plan should include strategies that address emotional, physical, relational, and spiritual health. According to Jennings, he emphasizes that proactive wellness planning rather than reactive self care builds long term sustainability in education. Wellness is not a luxury, it is a professional responsibility. Detachment doesn't mean indifference. It means protecting your well being while maintaining care. According to Figley suggests that when professionals maintain healthy emotional boundaries, they are more effective and less prone to burnout. For educators, this means recognizing where their role ends and the student's responsibility begins. Holding space for student trauma without internalizing it is an act of compassion for both the student and the self. School leaders play a very critical role in preventing vicarious trauma and burnout. Administrators set the tone for staff wellness by modeling boundaries, respecting personal time, and encouraging mental health conversations. When leaders normalize the use of mental health days, providing debriefing after crisis, and integrate wellness into professional development, they actually create an emotional safe environment for their staff. A trauma informed school does more than respond to student needs. It also evaluates the conditions under which staff are expected to perform. Organizational wellness audits examine workloads, staff morale, communication norms, and emotional safety. So this goes way beyond a survey just asking the staff, how do you feel? These audits provide critical insight into how the system may be contributing to burnout and what changes are needed to promote staff resilience. Trauma informed initiatives should not be confined to student interventions. A true trauma informed school embeds safety, trust, and empowerment into every level of the organization. This includes offering staff social emotional learning opportunities, creating wellness committees, and embedding mental health check ins into meetings. Whole school wellness models benefit both staff and students by improving relational trust and reducing reactivity. Some examples of staff focused wellness programs include mindfulness based PD sessions, access to counseling services, teacher wellness rooms, and stipends for mental health care. Schools can also implement designated reflection time, yoga or movement breaks, and trauma informed coaching. These programs shift staff care from being an afterthought to a foundation of school culture. It becomes a priority. Professional development must also evolve in order to address the emotional weight that educators carry. Instead of focusing solely on instructional rigor, districts should provide training in emotional regulation, compassion fatigue, and peer support models. When educators are equipped with tools for personal resilience, they are better positioned to meet academic and behavior goals. This presentation is designed to be adapted for multiple audiences. It can support school based professional development, serve as an advocacy tool for funding staff wellness programs, or be used in university courses preparing teachers and leaders. The message is universal, and educators deserve care also. Change starts with one small step: consistent action. Teachers can begin by developing wellness plans and initiating peer check ins. Leaders can evaluate school culture, reduce unnecessary pressures, and budget for emotional support. Districts can also review policies that reinforce overwork and instead invest in professional sustainability. Every level has a role to play in trauma informed transformation. To truly address educator trauma, we need policy shifts. This includes advocating for protected planning time, trauma informed PD requirements, accessible mental health services, and recognition of compassion fatigue in performance evaluations. Rethinking the superhero teacher narrative is essential. Our teachers are human and their well being matters. There's a common saying: you can't pour from an empty cup. Educators need to be seen, heard, and supported, not only for their sake, but because emotionally healthy adults create safe environments for children. Trauma informed work begins with adults. Let's stop asking teachers to sacrifice themselves and instead build systems that help them thrive. I want to close with this affirmation: rest is resistance, healing is revolutionary. Thank you for your time and commitment to educator wellness. Together, we can change the narrative from burnout to resilience, from silence to support, and from survival to healing. Thank you for listening to my presentation.